We're restoring another American-made tool with American-made tools. First things first, we need an inventory of the parts that need restored. The cup is misaligned, the C-style jaw has some deep pitting. The biggest issue is the friction plate clutch isn't working and there's some binding in the ratchet. The teeth need filed and the iconic Stevens Walden's handle is in rough shape. Getting right into the friction clutch, didn't have any problems getting off the screw, had some minor to medium rust inside the clutch, and the plates look about the same. It's been drying there for a while, but the friction has saved this thing from being a total mess. The patent number on the back of the housing from 1926 makes this one of the earliest forms of a locking mechanism on a spring compressor. That patent number led me down a rabbit hole for hours until I finally found a catalog from 1948. There isn't much information out there about these things, so I used the picture as a guide for this restoration. That means this compressor attachment and the cup are in for a color change. The adapter's in decent shape. It has some markings from the locking washer and some rust where it clamps down on the valve. The same goes for the cap. These low-level repairs make a huge quality difference to the overall final look. Run a quality check on the nuts and bolts while you're taking them off to see if the threads have any damage. Use a pitch gauge to figure out which tap and die to use so you can keep these things original. Check for any cracks or chips in the teeth. The last thing you want is for this part to fail in the middle of having a compressed spring with no retainers. If this or the clutch fails, you're going to have a bad day. Other than some surface level cosmetics, the housing seems to be in great shape. It doesn't look like it's the cause of any of the binding issues that it's having. The last piece to come off is the extension that mounts the cup to the jaw. It's seen better days and will need some extensive sanding to remove all the imperfections and pitting. The jaw isn't far behind. It needs the same things plus some extra attention along the spine. This valve spring compressor has a lot going for it. Most of the pieces need medium to light work to get them back to show quality. The teeth on the ratchet will need some extra filing, but most of the time will be spent on sanding and polishing. I started with the clutch housing because this is what makes this compressor so unique. I put aircraft paint stripper on to do the bulk of the paint removal. Hit it with a wire brush and reapply as many times as you need, but after you finish, neutralize it with some water and get it primed almost immediately. This piece had some burrs that were causing the binding issues. A light stroke of the file is all that's needed to remove these. Next up, we went into the sanding phase. Don't count the cost before you do this. If you do, there is no way you're signing up to polish anything. Just grab some 40 grit and get started. From there, you're going to want to go through 60, 80, 120, 180, 220, and 320 dry. I like to switch to a 320 wet at this stage, and then I used 400, 800, 1000, 1500, 2000, and 2500 to get me to the buffing stage. Your eyes have to be locked into the patterns on your piece. If you miss an area or a scratch, you'll have to backtrack sometimes several grits to find it. I spent a total of 17 hours sanding and buffing on this project. I kept a large portion of the footage for this piece, but it was too much to show everything for the entire video. I'll be sure to showcase other polishing projects in the future. At the final stage, I used 3 different pads, firm, medium, and soft. Make sure that you use a different type of polish for each one. Contaminating the pads can cause some polishing issues, so be sure to wipe away any excess polish on your piece. The ratchet had several burrs on the inside of the teeth. Carefully file these away so you don't take any excess material off the piece. The lever handle can be tricky. The best way to do this is by placing the handle in a lathe or a drill press. Next, hold sandpaper around it while the handle rotates. This will ensure that you keep the rounded portions true and centered. The wooden handle is an iconic part of Stevens Walden. I wanted to pay extra attention to this part. When you're sanding out the imperfections, you want to be careful not to compromise the integrity of the original shape. You can use some filler to level it out, but I opted to keep some of the imperfections in to avoid that filler. It's back to wet sanding the lever. For this, remember, it's important to take it all the way up to 2,500 or higher. Some people would even recommend going up to 4,000. I waited to wet sand the lever until after the wooden handle was finished. The last thing you want to do is accidentally hit your polished region with the 220 grit for the wood. Tape off the wooden handle before starting to polish. The buffing compound can easily fling off the pad, and that'll make it difficult for the stain to penetrate the wood. These pieces can get really hot when you're using that buffer wheel, so make sure that you're wearing some gloves that can insulate some of that heat. And every once in a while, stop and take a moment to appreciate what you've done. True to the channel, I went with the color Early American. This wood was really dry and soaked up 3 rounds of stain. The extension edges are really beat up, so I took some time to file those out to make them look clean again. The bulk of the workload for this piece is really just going to be about sanding, but because it doesn't have to go to a buffing wheel, then the sanding is a whole lot easier to do. The same could not be said for the jaw. This thing took forever. Most of that is because of how much surface area the thing has. The other big problem is how many pits were in there because of the rust. Speaking of rust, Evapo Rust to the rescue. I threw all the nuts and bolts in there and then took it to the polisher to get them ready to go. And the last thing to do before final assembly is to get these parts painted. I went with a Farm Series paint because it dries in a deep dark red, which is what I was looking for. And now that the parts are finished, just take one final moment to appreciate all the work you've done and just how polished and beautiful everything looks. Because as soon as you start that assembly, some of that grease is going to get on there and it's difficult to get back off. Really excited about how the red extension piece looks on here compared to what it looked like at the start of this project. The goal was originally to polish this piece until I found that 1948 catalog. It goes to show that doing a little homework before you start your restoration might make a difference. I put some grease in the upper jaw so that the housing could easily slide back on. With a few taps of the mallet, it locked right into place. Whatever you tap it on there with, just make sure it's soft. That way you don't mess up the integrity of the paint. Make sure you don't over tighten the bolts as well. Too much torque could cause some paint issues, or you could slip off the bolt and put that first ding into your product. Now that the housing assembly is put back onto the jaw, it's time to start to get some lubrication inside. This will allow the ratchet to move freely with the teeth from the arm. The problem is that the housing also contains the clutch assembly, which is operated on friction. It's okay to put some grease on the plates, but make sure that you wipe away any excess. I put a liberal amount at the start for the assembly, but once I had everything together, I dismantled, took it all apart, and then wiped away the extra grease inside. To maximize the life of the ratchet, make sure to put a generous amount of grease on those teeth as well. Now that it's in, you'll see the clutch plates going in with some grease just for general lubrication on there. After securing the screw and torquing it down, undo and wipe away any of the extra grease that remains in there so that the friction plates can do their job. The assembly grease was impossible to keep off the polished regions, so after wiping it down one more time, appreciate it before it's put to work. Like any restoration, I hope you're inspired to actually use the stuff that you restore and not just put it on a shelf. I wasted no time with this piece and I went straight onto a cylinder head. My goal here is to use it exactly as it's intended, pull the lever down by the handle, and engage the clutch plate by turning the screw. This will allow the valve spring compressor to stay in place while you grab something to remove the retainers. I find it easiest to do with a magnet. I take the back one off, then I rotate around the second one, and it just pops right back off easily too. With the retainers out, you are ready to disengage the clutch and release the lever so that the spring can be released. Admittedly so, I am extra cautious when taking this thing back off the head because I'm trying so hard not to scratch this. And just like that, you can grab the spring, remove it, and move on to the next spring or replace it. And of course, I'm not doing a valve job right now, so I'm going to put the same one back on there and go ahead and tighten it up to put on the retainers. Make sure when you put this on, the bottom of the cup goes straight into the valve, and then obviously the top goes right onto the top of the spring. Now you can grab the lever, pull it down, and replace the retainers so that this head is ready to go. The longest part of this process was the sanding. It took about 17 hours to do in total, and my favorite part was using it on the head. I hope I've inspired you to start your restoration today. We restored another American-made tool with American-made tools. See you next time.